So you could say that the church has perhaps projected their faith onto the historical Jesus. And that kind of rings true because we know every telling of a story tells you something of the storyteller. Now, whether that's one of the evangelists like Matthew, Luke, John, or Mark, or even a modern day biographer of Jesus, people do have a propensity to create the story of Jesus in their own image, and they often end up with a Jesus who is a lot like them. From 200 years of questing for Jesus, we've noticed the biggest temptation is to create Jesus in your own image. A liberal Protestant ends up with a liberal Jesus. A conservative evangelical ends up with a conservative evangelical Jesus, and so forth. So how can we get around this problem with our sources? How do we get around the propensity of interpreters to create Jesus in their own image? Well, scholars developed certain tools which they called the criteria of authenticity. It was thought that this little bag of tools could help you get around the problem of separating Jesus from the faith of the early church and help you escape the inherent subjectivity of studying Jesus. Now, these tools included things such as double dissimilarity. So this criterion said, well, a saying or story of Jesus is authentic if and only if it doesn't represent something that's been riffed in from Judaism, and if it doesn't sound anything like the early church. So if it doesn't sound Jewish or if it doesn't sound Christian, then you've got the authentic sayings of Jesus. Now, as we think of it, that criterion is just so absurd. You get a Jesus who doesn't sound like any of his contemporaries, and you have a Jesus who's completely divorced from his later followers. And imagine if you applied that same criteria to identifying the authentic teachings of Martin Luther. Imagine if you said sayings of Martin Luther are only true and authentic, historically speaking, if they don't sound anything like the medieval Christian tradition, and if they don't sound anything like later Lutherans. I mean, that would be absurd. No one would do history in that way. So the criterion of double dissimilarity, was quickly disregarded. But people wanted a more empirical way of doing it. So they came up with the criterion of multiple attestation. So, we've got multiple sources. There's the Gospel of John, assuming John is independent. You've got the Synoptic Gospels, and there you've got Mark, and you've got this double tradition. Maybe it goes back to a Q source. You've got Luke's unique material. You've got Matthew's unique material. Maybe there's some stuff in the Gospel of Thomas. Maybe there's a few other isolated sayings we call the agrapha, where you can find in other sources, like when the words of Jesus are quoted in Acts or in other places. Maybe you've got all these different sources, and where you can find some wording or a theme that appears in multiple sources, then it's the authentic words of Jesus. But even multiple attestation is kind of problematic, because some of the sources we talk about are very speculative. Like, was there a Q source shared between Luke and Matthew? I mean, that's postulated to explain the similarities between Luke and Matthew. But it's not the only solution. Maybe Luke just used Matthew. Or about John. Is John's tradition really independent? Or is John himself someone who is aware of Mark and maybe even Luke at some level? We don't really know what the sources are and the sources behind the sources. I mean, let me give you an example of this from my previous career in military intelligence. During the height of the global war on terror, there was a flash report saying that some terrorist event might happen in this particular location in the world. And it had allegedly been confirmed by American and British sources. So the Americans and the Brits saying, our sources say this event is going to happen. And they thought that was confirmation that this terror event was going to take place. The event didn't take place, because the Americans and the British were running the same source, and that source turned out to be unreliable. So even